afternoon. My name is David Satter. I'm here to speak to you on the subject of Marxism on behalf of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, part of their series of lectures concerning communism, its legacy, its significance, its meaning for the present day. We hear a lot about Marxism. It's almost on the lips, the term Marxism is on the lips of almost every political figure in the US, it seems. Uh, Oftentimes, it's used in a critical context. Uh, People say that given policy is Marxist, that uh, you know aspirations or views that are expressed are Marxist. But the reality is that very few people have actually studied Marxism and have a clear idea of what it is we're talking about. So Marxism becomes a kind of term of abuse, which is reasonable because, in fact, Marxism did a tremendous amount of harm, and we're going to go into that. But at the same time, uh, using it that way is not sufficient. I think that students should take it upon themselves to understand what it is we're really talking about, because this affects not just Marxism, but the whole field of study uh, that is implied by contemporary political issues. In any case, um, I want to go into the history first of Marxism, then describe a little bit about what the theory is, and finally how it was applied and what its consequences were. The history goes back a long way. In fact, it's rooted in the nature of authority, the concept of authority, which entered really the Western world with Plato 2,500 years ago. The When we talk about authority, we're uh, we have in mind something which is accepted as such. When authority begins to be questioned, it's no longer authority. Authority is inherent in the idea or the person, the idea itself or the person himself. And in fact, it didn't exist in the ancient world until it was established by Plato in the concept of transcendent ideas. Transcendent ideas, uh, explained most powerfully in the allegory of the cave in Plato's Republic, uh, are a source are considered to be the source of authority for what goes on uh, in in the realm of society, in the human world. Uh, Authority is something in the Platonic concept which is over and above the activities of human beings. When uh, Rome took over the ideas and the culture of ancient Greece, Plato's concept of authority was adopted with it. And when the Catholic Church uh, superseded when the authority of the Catholic Church superseded the authority of the Roman Empire, the teachings of the Old and New Testament, the testimony of the Gospels, the moral principles of the Judeo-Christian tradition, they took the place of the transcendent ideas that were first enunciated by Plato and established a concept of authority that was to basically dominate the West for the next 1,500 years. almost unchallenged. The critical change came in the 17th century with the discovery with the discovery of the telescope and the realization that the Earth, that the sun doesn't revolve around the Earth, but rather the Earth, that contrary to the evidence of the senses, it is the Earth that revolves around the sun. The discoverer of the telescope and the elucidator of this new scientific reality, Galileo, was forced to retract his his discovery by the Catholic Church, which feared that the realization that what appeared to us to be true was not necessarily true, that the evidence of our senses was not necessarily the absolute guide to what was true and what was false. Catholic Church understood that this was potentially a threat to the entire structure of authority that had existed for centuries and which provided a moral framework for the Western world. But science could not be so easily suppressed, and the consequences of the discovery of the telescope began to have very profound consequences for the ways in which people thought, undermining the whole idea of transcendent authority. The problem was that all of authority was based on revealed religion. Revealed religion was based on testimony. And if the evidence of the senses was not reliable, then we could not be sure that the testimony was reliable. Hence, we entered into a period of skepticism, the rise of science, but also the spread of all-encompassing doubt, which undermined, and insofar as all political structures were based on traditional religious authority, the stage was set for political revolution. The American and French revolutions, which took place in the 18th century, can be seen as attempts to find new sources of authority. In the case of the American Revolution, that new source of authority was held to be uh, self-evident truths, which in fact, of course, are not self-evident, but they were treated to be that all men are created equal. This was treated as self-evident, whether it was self-evident or not. But the revolutionary tradition was not established by the American Revolution. The American Revolution was successful in establishing and creating the conditions for political liberty. In that respect, the American Revolution is the source of the democratic liberty that it exists all in free countries all over the world. But it was not the American Revolution which established the revolutionary tradition, because it went no further than the proclamation of self-evident truths. It was the French Revolution which attempted to basically establish a new source of authority in the revolutionary process itself. And the French Revolution was very dramatic, it was very bloody, and it made a huge impression on the people who witnessed it. It seemed to be an unstoppable force, which was creating new realities in and of itself, outside the control of either observers or participants. The most important observer of the French Revolution was the German philosopher Georg Hegel, who, having witnessed the power of the French Revolution, the power of the masses streaming out into the streets, the process of revolution and then counter-revolution, in each phase creating a new political reality. He came, he conceived the notion that meaning, which was previously understood to come from a transcendent source, in uh, consistent with the tradition established by Plato many years ago, was in fact to be found in the historical process. That it was the process of history, of unfolding history, which was the source of legitimacy. Now, he interpreted this as a spiritual evolution with uh, uh, each phase of history uh, developing a new, more perfect consciousness. But what was important about Hegel is that he removed the source of history from a transcendent sphere to the historical process itself. And the historical process could not be limited by any man-made laws or any kind of ethical principles, because it was always in a position to create new laws and new principles. Well, it was this background that prepared the way for Marx. Marx was a student in the early 19th century in Germany. He was at first a young Hegelian, and the young Hegelians were young followers of Hegel who thought that they could apply Hegel's principles and his insights in order to uh, basically discredit everything that they considered illiberal, antiquated, oppressive, and unfair. It has to be pointed out about Marx, and this is something that many people don't understand, was that he was motivated, at least originally, by a fierce opposition to injustice and a deep sense that something had to be done to improve the situation of the working class. He was motivated in part by the contents of what later became the contents of the book, The Condition of the Working Class in England, by his colleague and collaborator, Friedrich Engels. But he had no direct firsthand experience of the working class. And when whatever contact he did have often ended badly because of his dogmatism. But what he did was he, in effect, turned Hegel's philosophy on its head. Instead of assuming that the historical process is the evolution of, results in the evolution of the spirit, he posited that the historical process was the liberation of and the of the masses of humanity and the ending of the contradictions in society. In effect, he took a theory that was idealistic and made it materialistic. Marx was a formidable polemicist. And in 1948, he published, as revolutions were taking place in Europe, he published the Communist Manifesto, probably the most powerful political pamphlet ever written and the most destructive. The point that he was trying to make was the basic principle that he tried to enunciate was that the chief protagonist of history was the industrial working class, and that a revolution uh, carried out by the working class would end in the complete liberation of the human race. Now, this this theory was rapidly proved to be illogical, uh, but in fact, it became a kind of secular religion. It it claimed to explain absolutely everything. It absolutized the working class, who became a kind of collective messiah, and it drew on spiritual energies that uh, had once reinforced a religious worldview, and now became the basis for the fanaticism of a political movement. The theory itself was rapidly disproved. Uh, Marx posited a deterministic progress of history. In other words, history moved in certain inevitable directions, and um, the the most developed countries, where the countries in which capitalism was the most developed, those were the countries in which the contradictions that he identified in the capitalist system would become the most acute, in which the distinction between the rich and the poor would become the most extreme, and where the revolutions would take place. But it was actually in the most developed capitalist countries that there began to be reform movements, and legislation was enacted, including against child labor, which was one of the things that Marx had been vehemently opposed to, and rightly so, uh, 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 leading to a great improvement of the condition of the working class and its um, turn toward reform instead of revolution. But there was one country where these developments uh, did not take place, and that was Russia. Russia was primitive by comparison to the countries of Western Europe, which were the object actually of Marxist theory. Uh, but Russia was vulnerable to a takeover of power. And it was at this point that a second element was added to the Marxist system, and that was Leninism. It might seem that, in fact, Leninism has absolutely nothing to do with Marxism, because Lenin held that the revolution would be created not by the working class, but by a group of professional revolutionaries who would consider revolution to be their full-time uh, occupation. But under these circumstances, of course, history could not be considered determinist. How could it be determinist and inevitable if, in fact, it required a group of fanatics in order to realize it? And the people who joined this professional party, which became the Bolshevik Party and then the Communist Party, were very far oftentimes from the working class. Most of them were intellectuals who claimed to speak for the working class and to know the interests of the working class better than than the workers themselves, to the point that if they were perfectly justified in opening fire and killing members of the working class if the members of that class didn't understand their own class interest, as interpreted by this party. But the two seemingly contradictory parts of the Marxist outlook, which later became known as Marxist-Leninism, actually uh, in political terms, complemented each other perfectly. On the one hand, you had a universal theory posited by Marx, which claimed to be infallible, which claimed to explain everything, and which claimed to predict a proletarian revolution. And on the other hand, you had a theory uh, uh, enunciated by Lenin, who claimed to be a Marxist, which in which a method for seizing power was was described on the basis of that universal theory. The result was Marxism Leninism, as it was called, and finally a theory and a method were joined together for destroying the sense of morality, the sense of right and wrong, the 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 religious-based worldview that had existed in the West for thousands of years. And this was summed up, in fact, by Lenin in his speech to the Komsomol in 1919, when he responded to claims that the communists, who had by that time seized power in Russia, a country which, according to Marx, was not ready for revolution, uh, he said that people accuse the communists of being immoral, but we are moral. Our morality consists of the morality of the revolution. Everything that serves the communist revolution is right. Anything that gets in the way is wrong. So, in other words, the idea of morality as a transcendent uh, 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 obligation, a set of rules that apply equally to everyone, was received a theoretical and political rejection and refutation in the form of Marxist-Leninist ideology and the communist revolution. This worldview began to be taught in the Soviet schools, and it consisted and I'll briefly summarize this because I do want to leave time for your questions. The average Soviet citizen knew practically nothing about Marxist ideology. There was a cadre of teachers who inculcated certain basic concepts that students were forced to repeat. And a student could get into a lot of trouble if he said something in a class in the Soviet Union or in any communist country which contradicted the ideology or demonstrated, even innocently, how illogical it was. But basically, the core philosophical assumptions of Marxism were contained in the theory of dialectical materialism. This is the idea that there's no spirit, no conscience, no God. Everything that exists is matter, and matter evolves through matter in motion. In fact, matter evolves dialectically. In other words, contradictions in existing matter create tension, which resolve themselves at a higher stage. On the base of this philosophical uh, uh, interpretation of the world, which was in fact profoundly negative because it denied the existence of anything human or spiritual in the human race, and in fact reduced people to unthinking automatons or spiritless animals. But nonetheless, this was widely accepted and even seen in some cases as liberating, because it threw off the superstitions of traditional religion, or at least that was what was thought. But on that base was a second theory. This was the theory of historical materialism, in which uh, Marx explained his version of how history involves. That feudalism was succeeded by capitalism, because the productive forces of capitalism, which grew up within the feudal system, eventually overthrew it. Capitalism gave rise to the industrial working class, which developed within the framework of capitalism. And when the contradictions between the capitalists and the workers became extreme, the workers overthrew uh, the capitalist class and created socialism. Now, the Marx had nothing to say about contradictions in the socialist system. On the contrary, he said that the working class would be the final class and that they would establish their domination. And the result would be the end of contradictions and an era of perfect freedom. This was the profound irrationality of the system, but this was what was taught. And a, a college student or a high school student, one of the most dangerous questions you could ask in a class in the Soviet Union was, well, if feudalism was succeeded by capitalism, capitalism was succeeded by socialism, what comes next after socialism? People who persisted in asking that question in Soviet schools could end up in mental hospitals, because that was not a question that was allowed. You talk about cancel culture, well, that was, and political correctness, well, that was enforced in the Soviet Union. The 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 but this system could not um, survive a confrontation with reality. And as long as it was a totalitarian system with total control of information, you could force people to act out the Marxist precepts and pretend that they were citizens of a happy, unanimous society in which everyone was devoted to building socialism. But the moment that free information was allowed, and that came in 1985 with the beginning of the Gorbachev glasnost, uh, all of the presumptions of the Marxist-Leninist worldview were first of all brought into question and finally undermined and destroyed. Because the artificial system that had been created by Marx and imposed with overwhelming violence by the Communist Party, uh, could not stand up. It was effective in discrediting uh, and in existing values, simply because it raised criticisms that the average person was not equipped to answer. But when it had to stand on its own, it of course, uh, and in the face of even mild criticism and even mild access to information, it rapidly came apart, leading to the end of the Soviet Union, the end of world communism, ultimately, although there are some communist countries that still exist. But basically, in its classic form, communism, with the exception of North Korea and Cuba, uh, no longer exists. And but nonetheless, the study of Marxism is important because the death toll for establishing this regime based on Marxism was horrific. And it was not an accident because the value, once a human being is deprived of a spiritual source of reference, he no longer is capable of relativizing the power of society. He no longer has inherent worth And if he no longer has inherent worth, he can be killed in in unlimited numbers. And that's what's happened during the Soviet Union. World communism as a whole probably, I mean, by various measures, claimed about 100 million victims. In the Soviet Union itself, maybe 20 million. But again, those figures are arbitrary because it depends how you're classifying. That was the classification that I used in one of my books, but there are other ways of citing figures that put the toll much higher. It was an absolute disaster, and it was the and it's a lesson for us today because the departure from common sense, from transcendent values, uh, from democratic institutions in favor of pseudo knowledge that can be used to criticize what exists, but can never be the basis of something new, had absolute catastrophic consequences. Now, because of the limits on our time, I want to now, uh, obviously, when it comes to Marxism, when it comes to the history of communism, there's a great deal more that we can say. However, our time is limited, and I want you in the audience to ask questions if you have any, and I'll do my best to answer them. Coming closer so I can see your questions on chat, if you have any. Hope you do, but um, oh, I do want to point out that the Victims of Communism Foundation, Memorial Foundation, is planning a seminar uh, in early July. I believe the dates are the 10th through the 12th, um, on some of these issues. And of course, uh, I definitely hope you will participate. Those of you who are taking part in this seminar, and we can develop some of these questions, which retain their importance for the simple reason that if we understand a lot of the criticism of the United States, of the American institutions, of the Western institutions, because we're talking also about democratic countries which are aligned with the US, is based on a lack of knowledge of what the alternative is. We take things like trial by jury, more or less effective justice system, despite occasional problems that arise. But basically, we have rule by law. We take that for granted. We have no idea what it means when a person can just leave work and be picked up on the street and with no one being told and no warning whatsoever, taken to a prison or to a torture chamber and tortured and murdered. So we of course don't appreciate what that means. There was just a chat which I've lost here. Hold on. In fact, one of the goals of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation is to help the schools and help all of you and all of us, uh, just to understand what the stakes are in the world, because this is really the best defense against ill-advised and extreme positions that are sometimes taken, in the context of our own politics. Well, see, we have uh, uh, just a few minutes left, but we want to use our time here. And I think that unless I get more responses on chat, what I will do is try to uh, explain why it is that Marxist regimes were so violent and why it was that there were so many victims. Uh, it's a strange thing, but Marxism attracted many idealistic people who had not thought through the implications because they saw it as an ideology of liberation. They said this was an intellectual tool that could be used to mobilize people in order to create a better life without understanding that a tool that was capable of mobilizing people on the basis of a lie uh, would never lead to a better life, but on the contrary would empower those who who wielded the tool. And that's exactly what happened. Without the ability to rely on the truth, without the ability to refer to observable reality, without the ability to question, the population was a prisoner uh, uh, of a small fanatical group that claimed for itself absolute power, absolute control on the basis of this mendacious ideology. When Lenin was confronted, for example, with contradictions in Marxist ideology and in particular in his application of Marxist ideology, he refused to discuss it, and he said that the principles of Marxism are as inarguable as the axioms of geometry. Many years later, I met Alexander Yakovlev. Alexander Yakovlev was, in fact, the inspiration for the policy of glasnost in the Soviet Union. And in that, which in fact brought down the Soviet Union because it provided for free information. And he told me, he said it was all, he started out as an Orthodox Marxist and a believer, as did many anti-communists were people who had first believed in communism and then understood its inherent evil. And he said, it was only much later that he understood that Lenin was, in fact, a complete revisionist, that he had that while pretending to advocate Marxism, he used it only as a device for suppressing argument. But what he said was totally inconsistent with the principles of Marxism. But it was this amalgam, but by that time nobody was arguing anymore. It was this amalgam of a universal theory, which in fact did not stand up to any kind of realistic examination, and a political technique, which, by the way, was taken from the first modern terrorist group, the People's Will in Russia, which was responsible for the assassination of Alexander II, the Tsar who liberated the slaves, the serfs in Russia. And so a terrorist organization became the model for the Communist Party. And the Communist Party behaved like it, once it was in power, behaved like a terrorist organization. Now, I hope that this brief discussion, which is always too brief uh, when it comes to serious historical and philosophical issues, will nonetheless inspire you to, or there is uh, will nonetheless inspire you to study further and participate in the activities of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, which are aimed really at creating a deeper awareness of our historical past. I mean, we need to understand history in order to understand the present. This is something that people oftentimes ignore, but uh, it's certainly uh, always been understood by wise people, and it needs to be to to be kept in mind today. In any case, I think we've reached the limit of our time limit, if I'm not wrong, and I don't want to go over that time limit. But thank you very much, those of you who've attended, and I hope that this discussion has been of some use to you. Uh, I'm just been informed that we're finished now. So all the best to those who've attended, and I hope you'll continue to follow this subject. Thank you.